Hello, how are y'all doing?
Good.
All right. I'd like to thank Mrs. Curtis not only for having me here tonight, but there are a number of folks who are out ahead of me on this issue. And she is one, and I can go back and search my email inbox from about 2011 and 2012, and I keep getting these emails saying, what about this Common Core? What should we think about this or that? And all of her forebodings have come true. And so I hope to give you a specimen of that tonight. How many of you want to take a Common Core quiz? Yeah. Okay. This is a kindergarten quiz, so we should all pass it in here because we're some pretty old folks. So let's see how we do. This is, for those of you who want to know what standard this is actually out of the Common Core standards. It's standard RF.K.3A, which means Reading Standards Foundational Skills, Kindergarten, Standard 3, Substandard, I guess, A. Demonstrate basic knowledge of one-to-one letter-sound correspondences by producing the primary sound or many of the most frequent sounds for each consonant. Okay, go ahead and do that. You should have paper out. I'll read that again. Demonstrate basic knowledge of one-to-one letter-sound correspondences by producing the primary sound or many of the most frequent sounds for each consonant. Let me go through that slowly. Demonstrate basic knowledge of one-to-one letter-sound correspondences. That's actually okay. Each letter has a particular sound. So if you know the letter, then you should know the sound it makes. That's okay. By producing the primary sound, so that means the leading sound, or many of the most frequent sounds for each consonant. Okay, now that's where we run into a problem. Because the primary sound of each consonant you could probably come up with, but how many consonants do you know who have many sounds? So many that you can only know the most frequently used sounds. Name one. Name any consonant that has more than 3 sounds.
C.
Well, C is, so an easy consonant would be B. It makes one sound.
Very good.
Or, thank you, C makes 2 major sounds, so k, as in coop, no, that would be a K, cook, or s, as in city. And then there are certain words such as the word, cello, which is a foreign word where you would have ch, but there are very few words that do that, and they're almost always foreign imports. So for the most part, C makes 2 sounds, with the third out there. X, you could say, it makes the x sound, and it also makes the z sound. But other than that, I can't think of a consonant that makes many sounds, so many that we would have to know only many of the most frequent sounds. But apparently the Common Core knows of such consonants. But it gets better. How about RF.K.3B, the one just after the one we've had? Associate the long and short sounds with the common spellings, graphemes, for the 5 major vowels. I'll say that one again. Associate the long and short sounds with the common spellings for the 5 major vowels. And when you listen to that, you probably think, okay, students are going to be taught vowels, and they have to know the long and short sounds, right? Listen to what I say again. Associate the long and short sounds with the common spellings of the 5 major vowels. A is a vowel. How many ways are there to spell A? I come up with 1. But apparently there are so many spellings that we can only learn the common spellings of the vowels. Does this make any sense to you whatsoever? So here's what we learned from the Common Core. This is a kindergarten standard, by the way. They don't get the consonants right. They don't get the vowels right. What's left to get right in the English alphabet? And furthermore, how fundamental is the English alphabet to the understanding, to the ability of being able to read and spell? Well, it's everything. So these standards that are written by all these so-called experts, and I'm sure many of you have heard this time and time again, oh, these are good standards. Oh, these are standards better than the ones that Michigan had before. Oh, these rate very highly according to the Fordham Institute or what have you. But when have you actually seen a legislator or a state school board member or for that matter, a superintendent stand up and say, we really like this standard that says we have to spell vowels in multiple ways. Never. And so 45 states in the Union, with no public discussion back in 2010, adopted these things, having no idea what they actually said and how insane they really are. Well, it gets worse, because if they can't get the letter A right, you can pretty well guarantee that they're going to get everything else wrong. And the Common Core, as I see it in the English standards, and I'm not even going to talk about the math tonight, which you may have experienced, which is just insane. But the English standards are basically designed to do this. Other than foul up the teaching of English, they're also designed to replace great literature that used to be read in English class, or what we used to call literature class, or English class, and to replace them with so-called informational texts, which are just sort of modern newspaper articles and things like that that are put into the curriculum under the guise of critical thinking. So that's what it is. We're taking away the great stories of a great people and we're replacing them with a new narrative, and that's the narrative provided by informational texts. Now at this point you're probably thinking, okay, well I don't know how serious that is. This seems like a professor talking to me. But I want you to consider this. This is something that Plato taught us over 2,000 years ago. Whoever controls the stories of any society controls the society. If you control the language and you control the stories by which people understand themselves, you control the regime. And so on the one hand, this looks like an educational program, and a controversial one that people just can't really wrap their arms around. But in fact what it is an attempt to kill off the great narrative tradition of American history and American literature and the culture of the West, and to replace it with something new. Well, it's not all that new, it's about 100 years old. And to replace it with something that puts our culture and our thoughts into the hands of a different sort of person with a different understanding of the world than the one that we have. And tonight I want to explain to you how that's going on. Well, first of all, you can see what I just said on the first page of the English standards. So if you download the standards and you look on the first page, they tell you, hey, we're going to replace so-called literary text with informational text. And this is because we live in a 21st century global economy and we have to do this in order to foster college and career readiness. This is their justification. And they say we're going to take all the literary texts and we're going to marginalize them to such an extent, they don't use that term, but by the time that you graduate as a senior in high school, your reading in an English class will be 70% of these so-called informational texts, and only 30% literature. Right? That's a formula that they give you. Well, that means you're not reading very much literature. And why are we doing this? This is the whole justification behind the Common Core. It's because we live in a 21st century global economy. And in fact, we need to create, and they say this, they use this term, we need to understand what literacy is for a 21st century economy. Now, how many of you, I would ask, learned how to read in the 20th century? All of them. Now, do you remember at Y2K what happened when all of a sudden you became automatically illiterate? Because you didn't have a 21st century literacy. Of course not. That's ridiculous. But what they're doing is they're trying to make us so afraid of the 21st century. We forget everything that we ever knew about the English language, or history, or the way the world works, and embrace whatever kind of educational program that they come up with. Well, that makes no sense whatsoever. Are you that afraid of the 21st century? Because I, for one, lived through a fairly good portion of the 20th century, and it was a pretty scary place. There were a couple of world wars, there was an arch enemy, there was a Cold War, and we did not face down those enemies and those problems by embracing progressive education, although over time, progressive education got into the schools. The next thing I would like to say, and this may sound a little bit professorial, but since when did college and career readiness become the aim of education? I never heard the phrase until 3 or 4 years ago with this Common Core. College and career readiness. Think about that. That means that you're going to school mainly to go out and get a job, because the emphasis is not on college, it's on career. Oh, okay, well fine. We all want people to have jobs. I understand that. But people used to have jobs in the past when college and career readiness were not the chief aims. And in fact, way back when, you probably have to go back to the early part of the 20th century for this and beyond, what were the aims of education? Well, they were truth and beauty and freedom and justice. Learning about all those things. Those are what the aims of education were. And those were high aims, as you can tell. Whereas career readiness, well, that could be dictated by whatever jobs are currently out there that a certain company, let's say Microsoft, says you ought to know to get a job with us. That's a different thing. And I can explain to you how different that is when you just think about this. And I'll do a survey. How many of you in this room are professional musicians? You live by making music. Okay, 0. And I think this audience holds about 100. The other night I was in Columbus and there were 600 people. The number was the same, 0. So it would seem that producing college readiness or career readiness and having a lot of attention spent on music would be not much of a proposition, right? Now ask yourself this question. How many of you in this room have a soul? Okay, I hope everybody, even if there are any politicians here tonight, or would be politicians. Everybody has a soul. How many of your children have souls? Well, all of them. So how would you educate your child's soul to understand beauty? Well, music is a pretty good way, and so is art. So is there any child who shouldn't have a robust education in music or art in the world? Well, here's the thing, and all you have to do is go to your local school district to figure this out. Music and art are dying a slow death in the schools. So much so that I've talked to multiple music teachers and art teachers who say they're being pink-slipped. Why? Just because the programs are closing down. If you're a child in the elementary school, you're lucky if you get art once every 2 weeks and music every week. And that is happening under this same regime that's coming in, which is telling us that college and career readiness is everything. And the stories that your children have to learn, or not the old stories, not the classics, but in fact, new stuff. Well, I'll give you an example, by the way. You're probably wondering what an informational text is. They actually don't define it very well. But here's one informational text. An article written in the 2009 edition of the New Yorker in June of 2009 called The Cost Conundrum, Healthcare Costs in McAllen, Texas, written by someone named Atul Gawande. You remember that article coming out, right? It was Shakespearean in its depth of understanding. Why do you think that the New Yorker was talking about healthcare costs in the summer of 2009? Exactly. So that's what it is. This is the way to get Obamacare into the school curriculum under the guise of an informational text and replace it, and it's replacing something great, right? Maybe Huckleberry Finn, for example, which is not recommended by the folks who are running the Common Core. So this becomes the justification in the way that we give up our great stories in English class, mind you, and put in modern schlock, which we'll talk about a little bit more. Now you may wonder yourself, why in the world would a people ever do something so insane and so ridiculous, and who could ever stand up and make this case? And this is where you have to inform yourselves and you have to actually get into the mechanics of how the Common Core works. And it's a code that's a little bit hard to unbreak, to break, but I'll try to help with that today. The first thing is, as I said, they don't just say we're taking away literature, they say we're bringing in these informational texts. That's the first place. But the next thing they do is they give you a set of standards, right? Is anybody in here actually tried to read the Common Core standards? You have, okay? And how did you get? How far did you get?
Not very far.
Not very far. Did you understand a single thing that you were reading? Okay? That shows that you're a sane person, and you're actually probably quite educated. Because anybody who can actually read these things and make sense of them has been doing the wrong sort of things with their thinking and education for a long time. They're written in educationese, in eduspeak that is impenetrable to laymen. And I myself don't speak eduspeak, but I can translate it. And so that's what I hope to do a little bit of here this evening. So let me give you an example of a standard. This is my favorite one. This is standard RL-2.9, which means Reading Standard for Literature, 2nd grade, Standard 9. And it reads as follows. By the end of the year, read and comprehend literature, including stories and poetry, in the grades 2 through 3 complexity band proficiently, with scaffolding as needed at the high end of the range. Makes perfect sense, right? Okay, let me help you out with this, okay? We'll translate it. By the end of the year, so that means by the end of the 2nd grade year, if that makes sense, read and comprehend literature. Okay, fine. Including stories and poetry. You know what? Literature does include stories and poetry. Dadgummit, thanks for pointing that out. In the grades 2 through 3 complexity band proficiently. That's just this jargon that they've created to talk about 2nd and 3rd grade, right? They group the grades and they put in what they call a complexity band. And we'll talk about that in a minute. So these students in the grades 2 through 3 complexity band will be reading literature with scaffolding as needed at the high end of the range. Where have you ever come across this word scaffolding? Have you?
Construction.
In building and construction. You may not know, but this is the educational buzzword at the moment and has been for about the last 3 years. Okay? Everybody in the education world talks about scaffolding. And as you can tell from the image of the building, when you're building a building, you have scaffolding. The building gets built. It helps the builders build the building. Once the building is built, the scaffolding goes away. In the old days, what we call scaffolding in schools was teaching. Or you could even call it help. So let's now translate our standard. Again, I'll read the original way. By the end of the year, read and comprehend literature, including stories and poetry, in the grades 2 through 3 complexity band proficiently, with scaffolding as needed at the high end of the range. Or, students in 2nd grade should read and understand more difficult books at the end of the year than at the beginning. They may need help, though. That's it. That's what the standard says. And this is not just said once, but it's said throughout these standards. Do we need to be told this? I don't think so. And so now that I've given you a little scaffolding in translating what these things actually say, we can move on and try to see what the standards are up to. One of the things, oh, by the way, when they say that they're going to offer all these complex texts at the 2nd to 3rd grade level, don't believe it. Because if you look in Appendix B, which we'll talk about in a minute, it shows you the actual texts they have in mind that are at the high end of the range. They're silly little stories that most of them were written in the 90s, or even later than that. They're not classic literature. There is no Hans Christian Andersen recommended in the standards. There is no Aladdin and the Magic Lamp recommended in the standards. There's nothing that you would regard as classic children's literature recommended in the standards. Instead, they have books such as Tops and Bottoms, which is a book that I think came out around 2001 or 2002. And if you look on the Amazon page for Tops and Bottoms, you find out that it is for ages 4 through 8. So they're saying this is a high-level text. There's another book called Cowgirl, Kate, and Cocoa, which is a monosyllabic book that has this kind of silly dialogue. For a 4-year-old, I'm sure the person would like it, but I don't know of any 8-year-old boy in the world who would want to read Cowgirl, Kate, and Cocoa. And if you don't believe me, just look online tonight and see the dialogue that takes place. So even when they set down a standard that doesn't need to be written in the first place because it's simply common sense, and then they promise that they're going to have these complex texts, it's ridiculous. They're not delivering on their promises. But we have to look at this word complexity, because that's where the sleight of hand takes place. Again and again they say complex, 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 complexity, complexity index, so on and so forth. And what they're doing is, by saying that students need to read complex texts, remember why? Because we're living in a 21st century global economy. They then say, here's the way we're going to determine how complex a text is. And they have this thing called the Lexile framework. And the Lexile framework is nothing in the world but it's just a computer model that grades text on how complex they are or how complex they're not, right? And so you spit in a work of literature or some sort of reading, and it spits out a number and tells you this is really complex or not. Well, that seems to me to be stupid, okay? Because we didn't have such a computer model for 2,000 years in the West, and we still knew what complex and interesting text were, right? I don't look at an algebra problem and say, you know what, that algebra problem doesn't have the same sense of humor that Mark Twain has. So, yeah, you're actually supposed to laugh at that one. So why in the world would we look at a text and say, let's stick it into a computer? Even so, the lexile framework is woefully inadequate as far as predicting text complexity. For example, The Grapes of Wrath, which you've probably heard of, maybe you've read, Steinbeck. 583 pages. What level do you think The Grapes of Wrath would be rated according to the lexile framework?
High school.
High school?
6th grade.
They rate it at a second grade level. I'm not kidding. A second to third grade level, and they admit that in Appendix A of the standards themselves. They say, yeah, there are a few problems that we need to work out with the lexile framework, such as The Grapes of Wrath being rated a second to third grade. That is ridiculous. But you see what's going on, right? The Grapes of Wrath is written in language that's everyday language. The words themselves are not difficult. The story itself, the complexity behind the characters in the story, that's complex. And so the computer model is meant deliberately to take down several notches great literature that's written in ordinary everyday language, and therefore to elevate these texts that are filled with jargon, such as journal articles written by professors, or New Yorker articles on Obamacare, or another favorite of mine is an 8th grade text that they recommend called The Evolution of the Grocery Bag, which I didn't know that grocery bags had actually evolved. But nonetheless, that's the sort of thing that they put in there up at the higher levels in the high school. So we purposely devalue great literature, and we overvalue these so-called informational texts. Think about the opening chapters of Genesis, for example. It's really simple language. There's nothing in there that a child could not understand in terms of the language. But when you look at how complex and interesting and deep are the themes in the opening chapters of Genesis, the creation of the universe and the creation of man, what can you find that's deeper? You see what I mean? But that would totally be lost on the lexile framework. So, using this computer model, what we then do is we're at the service, essentially, or we're at the beck and call of these wizards of the Common Core to tell us what complex texts are and what complex texts aren't. Because, of course, no teacher can just say, well, I think we ought to read some Orwell. Instead, it has to go through the system. There are a couple of other little tricks they put in there, but this is maybe the most mischievous. So that takes us to Appendix B of the standards. And Appendix B is where they give their recommended books that they think that students ought to be reading. And this is where some, though not all of the mischief takes place. Well, this has troubled people. Has anybody looked at Appendix B to look at the selections of things that you should read? This throws a few people off, right? Because if you look at Appendix B, you will find the name Shakespeare. You will find the name Twain. You will find the name Ronald Reagan. And you think, wait, if this is politically biased or motivated, or if these people don't have our best interests of our children at heart, why would they have Shakespeare in there? Well, there are 2 or 3 things to understand about this. Number one, even though they have these names in there, what you notice about standardized testing is that it forces students not to read entire complete works of literature, but to read only snippets of literature, and never a whole book. So if they're lucky, they'll get a chapter out of Moby Dick, but they won't get the whole thing. And that is not something that's set up in the Common Core standards to be able to prevent. That's the first thing. But the second thing is, you can determine and you can read where there is clear bias in Appendix B itself. And this is the Common Core on its best behavior. So for example, look through the Common Core standards and try to find any religiously inspired literature. I don't think you'll find any. The folks who wrote the Common Core claim that they like autobiography. And yet, the great foundational autobiography in the West is Augustine's Confessions. It's not to be found in the Common Core. The greatest epic ever written in English has got to be Milton's Paradise Lost. There is no mention of John Milton, which of course is about the opening chapters of Genesis. There is no mention of Milton in the Common Core standards. Well, an old text that we used to read, that's not even, it should be an informational text, or it would be a text in rhetoric, would be a sermon. Sermons have been, other than political speeches, have been the #1 way of speaking in the history of the West. And supposedly the Common Core is teaching speaking skills, or whatever they end up calling them. You will find no sermons, particularly you won't find the old one, Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God by Jonathan Edwards, which used to be read in almost every high school in the country. So in other words, there is no literature that has been influenced by any sort of Christianity. Now how profound is that? It's profound in the sense that the way that we used to understand the West as being the children of two different parents. Jerusalem on the one hand and Athens on the other. And if you totally take out and wipe out one of those parents, and then the other one is sickly, what you have is an educational institution that's taking you to cultural orphanage. And that's what's going on, because both of these traditions are being robbed. Another example of this is there is no mention in the standards. And remember, they're supposed to like autobiography, and they're supposed to like complex, non-fictional categories of text. There's no Benjamin Franklin. Even though Benjamin Franklin's autobiography used to be a classic that was read in English classes by everybody. In my grandfather's day, even up into my day, we read selections of it. There's none of Ben Franklin's satires. There's none of his scientific experiments, which he explains in the autobiography. There's no Benjamin Franklin. Why? He is the greatest man of letters in the 18th century, and he's a founding father. But think about Benjamin Franklin's life and career. He is the anti-bureaucrat. He started his own school. He started his own fire department. He ran the post office in the only time in its history when it actually made money. And Benjamin Franklin, in order to discover the principles of electricity, did not have to write an application for a federal grant. He went out with a kite and he did it. So I think that the folks in the Common Core do not want your students reading Benjamin Franklin, even though he is the very spirit, the very incarnation and architect of the American character. So that's what's going on. That's part of what's going on in Appendix B, but it gets worse than that. Because when you get to one of these troubled places where you think, okay, this doesn't seem like bias to me, you find out that it actually is. So for example, in the middle school and then again in the high school, they recommend the reading of a selection of the Constitution. Only a selection. Well, why not read the whole Constitution? You might say, well, it's English class, maybe they'll read the whole Constitution in their civics class. Okay, fine. In the 8th grade, they recommend the reading of the preamble to the Constitution and the First Amendment. Of course, not the Second Amendment. Not the 10th Amendment. Okay, fine. But at least they're reading some of the Constitution, right? Well, here's the trick. And this is in the Common Core documents themselves. They tell you that the students should read the preamble and the First Amendment to the Constitution. And then 2 inches below that, they have a selection taken from a modern author who has written a book on the Constitution called Your Annotated Guide to the Constitution, Words We Live by Linda Monk. And here's how this selection goes. The first 3 words of the Constitution, and I am reading, the first 3 words of the Constitution are the most important. They clearly state that the people, not the king, not the legislature, not the courts, are the true rulers in American government. And of course, there was no king by 1787, but we'll just pass over that point. This principle is known as popular sovereignty. Okay, so far, so good. Popular sovereignty is important. Next paragraph. But who are, quote, we the people? This question troubled the nation for centuries. As Lucy Stone, one of America's first advocates for women's rights, asked in 1853, quote, we the people? Which we the people? The women weren't included, end quote. Neither were white males who did not own property, American Indians, or African Americans, slave or free. Justice Thurgood Marshall, the first African American on the Supreme Court, described the limitation, quote, Marshall, for a sense of the evolving nature of the Constitution. Do I need to write that word on the board? For a sense of the evolving nature of the Constitution, we need look no further than the first 3 words of the document's preamble. We the people. When the Founding Fathers used this phrase in 1787, they did not have in mind the majority of America's citizens. The men who gathered in Philadelphia in 1787 could not have imagined, nor would they have accepted, that the document they were drafting would one day be construed by a Supreme Court to which had been appointed a woman and the descendant of an African slave. Translation? The founders were racist, sexist. This stuff in here is not even true.
What was that?
Linda Monk. And you can find this on page 95 of Appendix B in the standards themselves. And of course, the wrong-headedness of this historiography we could go into at great detail. To begin with, if they're talking about the franchise as being guaranteeing what constitutes we the people, the Constitution doesn't prevent anybody from voting. The franchise for the House of Representatives is in Article 1, Section 2. There are actually women in certain states and free black males at the time of the ratification of the Constitution who voted. And throughout the 19th century, as women gained the vote, the Constitution did not have to be altered at all. So the founders didn't prevent anybody from voting. And we could go into a host of other things. But the point to know is this. What the Common Core does is set up a model of what you're supposed to do in the textbooks and what you're supposed to do in the classroom. You can act like you're reading the Constitution. But what you're really going to do is you're going to deconstruct it in such a way as to put blame on the Founding Fathers. And this is not just an isolated incident. In fact, I was just talking to some gentlemen who have a classical Christian school in town here, and sorry, not in town, but in Michigan. And they showed me a document that comes out that's being produced that's aligned with the Common Core. It's called, what's the title? Hold on. Reading and Analyzing Nonfiction. Slant, Spin, and Bias. So what you're supposed to do in reading nonfiction is show all the bias behind it. Well, guess what one of the featured texts, in fact, the one that they feature in order to sell the book, guess what one of the featured texts is that has slant, spin, and bias? The Declaration of Independence. And they start out by saying, well, these self-evident truths that the founders were talking about, everybody knew at the time that there were monarchs, and therefore it wasn't a self-evident truth. As though the Founding Fathers didn't know what a monarch was. It's ridiculous. But that's the model that is set up, and that's what we're supposed to do, to take an axe to the Founding Fathers. This is not an isolated incident. They do the very same thing with the way that they study the Constitution at the senior level. So, what else is going on? Well, that's Appendix B. And remember, this is the Common Core on its best behavior, because they want this to pass. When you look into the textbooks, it gets worse. It gets worse than you can possibly imagine. I knew the textbooks were biased, but until I started looking into them last summer, I had no idea the nonsense that you would find in them. So let me take in another example, and this is one that's teed up by the Common Core itself. Remember I told you that they say Ronald Reagan is you have to read. There's a selection from Ronald Reagan in Appendix B that's recommended. Okay? How could we possibly misconstrue Ronald Reagan? Well, let's say that we were going to have a speech of Ronald Reagan in a textbook that would be read for its style in English class. Okay, good. What speech would you pick? Brandenburg Gate speech, Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall. If you had a second choice, what would you pick?
Shining City on Hill.
Okay, you would take his inaugural, his farewell speech, or his first inaugural. The Normandy speech, which will bring tears to your eyes, or how about going all the way back to his Goldwater speech in 1964?
Oh, yeah.
So any of those speeches would be Reagan at his best, right? In the Common Core standards, you have this little-known speech that was given at Moscow State University towards the end of the Cold War. And when I first saw that, I just scratched my head and thought, why that speech? That doesn't make any sense. But when you look at a textbook, you figure out the key and you break the code. So here is what Pearson Prentice Hall's Literature, Grade 10, Common Core Edition, does with Reagan. First of all, in the unit, it's called the Cold War. They have an editorial taken from 1999 on the 10th anniversary of the fall of the Berlin Wall. And they have an editorial from the New York Times. Here's how it begins. The Berlin Wall was bound to fall eventually. You remember back in 1980 how the New York Times was just having daily reports about the wall was going to come down any minute, right? At any rate, that's the first sentence. The Berlin Wall was bound to fall eventually. Second sentence. But that it came down as bloodlessly as it did 10 years ago this week is largely a tribute to one leader. Today, Mikhail Gorbachev is a political pariah in Russia and increasingly forgotten in the West. But history will remember him generously for his crucial role in ending the Cold War and pulling back the Iron Curtain that Stalin drew across Europe in 1945. So in other words, Gorbachev, he's pretty much responsible for the end of the Cold War, right? Not to mention the fact that, well, we'll go on. The point is, in this article, the 1999 editorial, and in the entire unit called The Cold War, Ronald Reagan doesn't appear once. Beyond that unit, we have, tucked away in a different unit, with a lot of coloring on top of it that I think makes it unreadable, we have Reagan's speech, the one that was recommended in the Common Core. But here's what happens. The editors up above that speech have a little paragraph introducing the students and presumably the teachers to the speech. And here's how it begins. Led by Mikhail Gorbachev, the Soviets were blazing through the greatest changes they had seen since the 1917 revolution. Although reforms were rapidly taking root, they were not far enough from communist ideology for Reagan. In this excerpt, notice how Reagan restrains his strongly anti-communist sentiments while still extolling the ideals he represents. So that's how you remember Reagan, isn't it? Always restraining his strongly anti-communist sentiments so he wouldn't get in the way of Gorbachev and the Soviets who were tearing down the wall on their own. That's the way the event gets remembered. That's the way Reagan gets remembered. But it's scarier than that. The student would be reading this at age 16 as a sophomore in high school. Now use your Common Core math. When would a student have been born who is currently a sophomore in high school? What year? 1998? 9? Okay. What does somebody who was born back then know about Ronald Reagan? Unless the student has spent a lot of time talking to his parents or grandparents, he doesn't know anything. So this is all how you learn history in an English class, where the English teacher probably doesn't know to defend it, because she hasn't taken any history, or not much. And so this is how you get an English class politicized and history being rewritten